Today on the Transplant Helper, I'm going to be answering a viewer's question from a person who really they're struggling, wondering if they're ever going to climb that list. And I'm going to be sharing with you some tricks, some tips you need to know, and particularly one thing you need to know in order to move up that transplant list just a little faster. Stay tuned. Hit the subscribe button and the bell notification to become part of the Transplant Helper community.
This is one of those questions I found in a Facebook group. In turn, sent a private message, answered that question, but I wanted to share the answer with you. And I won't actually read the whole question because it's pretty lengthy and pretty detailed. But here's the gist of what's happening. We've got a patient here who is awaiting a heart transplant, has been waiting now for a very long time, like 3-4 years, so above the average in waiting in that. They're not very high under this new status listing system, which goes 1 through 7. They're not currently listed very high on the list, so the probability and the likelihood of actually getting a transplant is not very high percentage-wise because they're just not that far up on the list. Now, that becomes disturbing because this patient realizes that they're getting sicker and sicker. They just don't feel well anymore. They're not able to get up and go. Their get up and go is got up and went, as the commercial said when I was a child. That was the hankering for a hunk of cheese commercials that played on Saturday morning. If you've ever heard about that, thumbs up this video. I don't know. You'd have to be old to do that. Thumbs up the video anyway. They just don't have the energy. They don't have the stamina. And they're really even more concerned with the fact that their ejection fraction or their EF has gotten down to like the 10% range, which would definitely be low enough to qualify someone to not only be on the transplant list, but in general to be higher on the transplant list than, say, another person. That's just a fact of life. But their particular team has at this point not been willing to raise their status very much because when they go into the labs, when they take blood work and blood draws and other procedures, even though that EF is extremely low, again, down around that 10% range, they actually show some pretty good numbers in other areas. And so I immediately tried to answer that question or help with that question because for me personally, I dealt with the same thing. When I went through this transplant process, again, almost 7 years ago, but even before that, for 6 years prior to transplant, leading up to it, I was actually evaluated 4 different times. And I've told that story before, but basically, I was evaluated 4 times because every time they would take me into the cath labs, take me into pulmonology labs, do the blood work, do the echoes, all that, even though some things about my situation seemed terrible, they called it stage 4 heart failure, there were other things that always seemed better than they should be. They didn't make any sense. For example, my blood pressure was always like 125 over 75. So absolutely perfect. Most people would dream of a blood pressure like that. It was always the case that I didn't have a lot of fluid retention. I had some in my face and some in my belly, but as far as the typical heart failure symptom of having fluid in your feet, your hands, that sort of thing, but particularly your feet and ankles, I didn't really have that. There were a few days I had a little puffiness, but I never had major edema or swelling from that or as a result. So that didn't really look like heart failure. When they went into the cath lab sometimes, my EF, like this person's EF is 10%, my EF would be like 25, 26 a lot of times. And that would vary a little bit. There were so many things that they would take me in and test me on it. And even though they would say, okay, he definitely qualifies for transplant over here, he's in bad shape. On the other side of that, he comes above bar over here. So there was a huge back and forth discussion that related to my numbers. And most of that went back to the fact I was a pediatric cardiology patient because my heart was actually reversed at birth and some corrective surgeries were made at 6 months. My numbers never did show the same numbers that everybody else did. So when they looked at the general population and its baselines, my numbers were generally as good at in some areas or maybe better than the general population. Now, that doesn't say, again, that I wasn't in stage 4 heart failure because I was. They had enough proof and enough evidence to say that I was, but they didn't have enough experience to be able to nail it down and say for him, an EF should be this, and for him, pulmonary function should be that, and for him, his, I just lost the word, but the blood stuff that represents that you've got heart disease or heart attack, I can't even think about it. I did a whole video on it a while back, but the blood work didn't match. There was a lot that didn't match. The fact that my parking deck in my transplant center is like 3/4 of a mile from the doctor's office. And every time I got there, I walked in the parking deck, I walked out. Most people were being wheeled in wheelchairs. So many things didn't seem to measure up. But thankfully, my team throughout that time realized that I was a congenital heart patient, pediatric growing up. My pediatric cardiologist had been with me all the way until adulthood. So until I was, I think, 32, 33, I had actually only been followed by pediatric cardiologists. It was at that point they turned me over to the transplant/heart failure teams. But even then, my doctors continued to follow my case. They continued to be a voice and a piece of advice in that. And they continued to say in the ears of the heart failure doctors, look, his numbers may look one way, but he could very well be another. So, I kind of dealt with some of that. I dealt with the fact that they didn't necessarily want to list me or feel if they needed to list me because my numbers didn't seem low enough in certain areas. Now, fast forward to the fact when I finally did get listed, after that fourth attempt, I agreed to be listed finally. They agreed to list me finally. They decided it was urgent. They did it then based on a few things. Number one, they based that listing on the fact that because I was pediatric, I was considered quote unquote volatile. And they use the word volatile to mean that in a pediatric case especially, a person can go along for decades, for years and years and decades, and do very, very well. Have a few symptoms, a few signs, rhythm issues, maybe a little bit of weakness on one side of the heart or the other, a little bit of stiffening of the muscle, which I had all of that eventually. But they can have all of this and seem to go on a pretty flat plane for a long time and then crash. And they knew from experience that a lot of those pediatric patients, again, stayed on the level plane, and then they may be out walking in a 5K one day, and the next day, bam, they can't get out of bed. They're swollen, filled with fluid, difficulty breathing. Things can turn bad fast. I was having VTAC, or ventricular tachycardia, which is the rhythm of death, having non-sustained VTAC. So they were really cautious. Anyway, I'm talking too much, but I did want to share with you, that's kind of what I've been through. Now, how does that apply to this person's question? Well, I don't know their whole history by any means, but what I suggested to them is that they go in and sit down with their team and talk to them about what is called the exemption status. Now, the exemption status basically means that they can give you an exemption to either list you, which in this case I think they're listed, or to move you up the list, even though you don't meet all the basic general criteria for being listed at said status, okay? So like in my case, back in 2013, one of the things that would have gotten me to the very top of the list easily was either one, to have an LVAD done. I wasn't a very good candidate for an LVAD because of my anatomy. Or two, they can install a heart pump, which is, where they go up through your groin and your arteries and they put a small pump that assists and, helps out the heart. My anatomy did not go for that. Three, one of the things that could have helped me to be on the top of that list was to be in hospital, particularly with a device called a Swan Gans, which comes in right here. It looks similar to a central type line that would be here or in the chest, but it comes in right here and it takes constant pressures. It's like being in a cath lab 24/7, so they constantly view your pressures. Wasn't a candidate for that because of my anatomy. All these things that they normally would have done for me to be sure that I moved where I was, which was listed as a status 2B, so just a little down the list, up to that status 1A where I would legitimately get transplanted, they couldn't do. So they placed me in the hospital. I was on an IV drip called Milrinone. I've talked about that drug before. And one of the things they did, they said, well, we've got to get you that exemption status. And the way to do that is to jump through some other hoops and basically present to United Network for Organ Sharing and all these other organ procurement organizations, present to them as a team and say, look, I get that he doesn't have the typical assistant devices and treatments that everyone else does. And we get that he doesn't have typical heart failure symptoms, meaning he's not filling up with fluid. He's not having difficulty breathing. Given the fact that I was still walking every day, I walked 3 miles the day of my transplant. So leading up to my transplant, I walked 3 miles that day. So I was doing a lot that most people could not do. And I was blessed to be in that position. But they applied for the exemption status, which basically said, even though he doesn't meet all these criteria, we still feel that his condition is so volatile and he could take a dive at any day, any moment, that the best case scenario is to get him up to status 1A, which at that time was the old system, but the very, very tippy top of the list, get him up to a 1A, and then see what happens. And so they did that. They ramped my milrinone up, which was one of those exemptions. If your milrinone level was high enough, if they're, having to use enough milrinone 24/7 like they were me at a high enough dose, that within itself became an exemption. So that way, when the whole everybody involved stood back and looked at my case, they said, okay, he's got this, not that, not this, not that. They would say, but his milrinone is so high till that proves that he's in a danger zone. As a matter of fact, by the time you were listed, and this is the old system, okay, we got a new system now, but by the time you were listed as a status 1A in the hospital, the true reality was that it was assumed then that you were within 30 to 45 days of death. That's basically what the old status 1A meant. That was the team signing off, claiming that based on the evidence we have and our predictions statistically, we believe this person, me in that case, hard to think about, but this person has basically 30 to 45 days to live. So the reality was that's what they had to think. That is what they did think, by the way. Again, volatile was the word they were using. But they were able to get that exemption status. And I said all that to say this, to answer the question. Again, sit down with your team. Ask them specifically about the exemption status. That will probably, if they haven't discussed it before, that will probably catch their attention. And they'll understand that you're educated to the point that you know things, good things in this case, and mention to them about the exemption status. Ask what they can do. Because if your EF is at 10%, if you feel like garbage every day, you're not able to function, that plays a huge role into if you should be listed. Again, I know you are, but where you should be listed at that point. So a lot has to do with some tricks that they can pull, for lack of better terms, those exemption status. And a lot has to do with more than what we understand, with how we feel. Heart failure, yes, can be measured. Heart failure can be seen in a cath lab, seen behind an echocardiogram, seen in a CT or MRI scanner. All these things, these tests, can prove heart failure. They can. However, what proves it as much, if not more so, is how you feel, okay? And so I've learned over the years, and I still do this. I learned to do it prior to transplant, and I still do it now. When I go into my doctor's office, to the clinic, I always express to them how I feel, how I actually am able to function that day, what I'm actually able to do. They used to ask me all the time, can you brush your teeth? I always was able to brush my teeth, but when they asked me, how about taking a shower or bathing yourself? I could, but I'd have to crash for 2 hours. And they needed to know that because they're looking at numbers. They're looking at absolute objective standards on tests saying, well, he's not that bad. But when they find out the guy can't even shower without nearly passing out, and I couldn't bend over to tie my shoes without passing out, that was an issue. So go in and ask for the exemption status, and hopefully maybe they can do something for you in that case. I think they can, but hopefully they will. Hopefully they'll go ahead and attempt to do something for you to help you out, to get you that exemption status and get you moved up the list. Because the higher you are on the list, as we understand, again, even under the new system, which goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the higher you are on the list, the more likelihood you'll be transplanted. With the amount of wait time you've already had, with your EF the way it is, and again, that's all the evidence I have about that. I don't know your case, but especially with your current experiences as far as the way you feel, I would say you need to be higher up. I can't do that, obviously. I'm not a medical doctor, but I would say you need to be higher up on the list. We need to get this thing done, get it behind you so your opportunities can.
So anyway, I hope that helps out a little bit. I hope that kind of gives you some idea, some baseline as to where you can get started. But overall, yeah, I think reaching out, trying to get these exemptions, that's probably going to be your best bet. But also understand at the end of the day, I'm thankful it's actually this way. The sickest people get transplanted first, okay? And that's just a system that hopefully is fair in what it does, and hopefully will give you the gift of life very, very soon. Until next time, each and every one of you, stay stronger, friend.